Here's the thing about growing up. If your childhood involved any kind of dirt, whether it was a dusty farm road, a beat-up backyard trail, or even just a gravel pit where you weren't technically supposed to be, then the name DT probably hits different. You already know. And if it doesn't, well, give it a few minutes, because by the time we're done here, it will. Yamaha just quietly dropped the 2026 DT50MX, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say this little machine might be the most significant small bore bike they've rolled out in a decade or more. The price? Oh, that's going to throw you for a loop. Not for the reasons you think either. Stick with me. First things first though, let's clear the air. What the heck is the DT50MX? And more to the point, why on earth is Yamaha wasting resources on something so tiny in an era of 1,000cc hypernakeds and adventure barges? To get that, you've got to hop in the Wayback Machine. 1981, the original DT50MX lands on the scene, a lightweight little terror with a monocross rear suspension that pretty much owned the 50cc class across Europe. It was cheap as chips, dead simple, and it taught a whole generation where the clutch was. They barely changed it for 15 years. Why would they? It worked. Now, they're dusting off that same playbook, but for a world where a decent beginner bike costs as much as a used car, and most brands have completely given up on small stuff because there's more money in big stuff. So here's Yamaha's big pitch, a lightweight, single-cylinder dual sport that's built on that same old-school philosophy. Low cost, low weight, zero intimidation, but with a massive dose of fun. Small, yeah, but basic? Not so much. Underneath that retro shell, they've stuffed genuinely modern bits and pieces, and honestly, that contrast is half the reason anyone's even talking about it. Real quick, be honest with me. How many of you cut your teeth on a bike that was just a little too much for you? Come on, most of us, right? Because your typical beginner bike is either a wheezy scooter that feels like a toy or a detuned version of a real bike that's still too heavy and too tall for a newbie. The DT50MX is gunning for that sweet spot in the middle, and from what's on the spec sheet, they just might have nailed it. Let's peek under the plastics, because this is where it gets good. They've squeezed in a 49cc-ish air-cooled single-cylinder four-stroke, but here's the kicker. It's got electronic fuel injection, not some crusty old carburetor. Huge upgrade. You get easier cold starts, way snappier throttle response, and fuel economy that could legitimately bust past 100 miles per gallon if you're not wringing its neck constantly. Power is going to be somewhere around 4 or 5 ponies, which sounds pathetic until you remember this thing probably tips the scales at under 200 pounds wet. That's where the grin factor lives. You're not waiting for the power, you're already there. The frame's keeping that lightweight vibe going. Think steel backbone or cradle. Up front, there's telescoping forks with enough travel to smooth out a rocky trail, and out back, a single shock that carries on the monocross tradition the original made famous. Wheels are a dual-purpose setup, bigger front for stability on loose stuff, smaller rear wrapped in rubber that feels right at home on dirt, gravel, or pavement. Brakes? Front disc, rear, drum, or disc depending on market. Honestly, it's more stopping power than these things used to have, which is a godsend for newbies still figuring out their braking zones. Pause with me for a second, because I want to ask you something. If you were designing the perfect first motorcycle from scratch, what goes on the list? For my money, it's not horsepower. It's not a fancy TFT dash. It's predictability. A bike that does exactly what you ask, when you ask, with no nasty surprises. That way, you're building trust, not fighting the machine. And honestly, that's the whole ethos behind this bike. And the seat height? This is where it leaves a lot of dual sports in the dust. Most adventure wannabes, even the smaller ones, sit you up around 32 or 33 inches. That's a problem if you're shorter or still developing that leg muscle and confidence. The DT50MX looks to be closer to 30 inches, maybe lower. It doesn't sound huge, but trust me, there's a world of difference between putting both feet flat at a stoplight and tippy-toeing it after a month. Speaking of which, the gearbox. This is one of those tiny details that matters a ton. Word is it's a manual, 4 or 5 gears, no CVT, no automatic. That's a deliberate choice. A lot of buyers in this space are parents shopping for their kid or grown-ups who genuinely want to learn clutch control and shifting without the fear of looping a 600cc superbike. It's a smart move. Here's a thought that popped into my head. You remember that time you dropped a bike in a parking lot? We've all got one. On a big adventure bike, that's a crushed mirror, a bent lever, and a bruised ego for the rest of the week. On a DT50MX, it's a chuckle and a funny anecdote later. That's not trivial. That's the whole point of a bike like this, and it's probably why this little category has been blowing up in online forums lately. People are realizing they don't need 150 horsepower to have a blast. Now, what kind of life is this thing gonna live? Let's be real, it's not a cross-country mile muncher. Yamaha is pitching it for what it's always been. Short trail rips, errands around the neighborhood, farm or ranch chores, and as a no-fuss platform for building real-world skills before you go for the big boy license. In some places, depending on the laws, a 50cc bike can even slip under moped or learner permit rules, opening the door for folks who can't get a full endorsement yet. That's a massive deal. Styling? They're leaning hard into the retro Trek vibe. Think tucked-in headlight nacelle, slim tank with subtle knee cutouts, high front fender for mud clearance, and a two-tone paint job that's an obvious wink to the 80s originals. It doesn't feel like a costume, more like a respectful nod. Nostalgia sells, sure, but only if the bike's got the goods to back it up. Retro look, modern bones. That's usually a winning formula. All right, let's get to the elephant in the room, the price. Based on Yamaha's history with small dual sports and looking at where the TW200 sits in the lineup, I'd bet real money the DT50X lands in that sweet spot between $2,200 and $2,800 before fees. That makes it a steal compared to anything else they sell, half the price of moving up to the next displacement tier. It'd be one of the cheapest brand new motorcycles you can buy in the States, period. Why does that matter so much right now? Because the industry's got a new rider crisis, plain and simple. Prices have ballooned, and all those cheap, fun little bikes that used to hook people when they were young, they've vanished from showrooms. A good, capable 50cc at this price isn't just a product, it's a lifeline. It's trying to rebuild the bottom rung of that ladder the whole sport depends on. But here's the nagging question that's been buzzing in the back of my head, the one we gotta ask. Why would Yamaha, of all companies, go through all this trouble, reviving a 45-year-old badge, engineering modern EFI into a tiny motor, pricing it for pennies, instead of just letting this segment die like everyone else? On paper, it doesn't seem to make sense, right? And that right there is the twist, because everything we just walked through, the engine, the height, the price, the throwback styling, it all comes from a logical place. Yamaha has the history, the tech, and the market position to make this thing real. The 2026 DT50X isn't sitting on a showroom floor yet, to be clear. This is a reconstruction, a concept built from actual Yamaha history and current pricing strategy, pieced together like a puzzle. None of what you heard was pulled from thin air. Every spec is grounded in something real. Which, honestly, makes this whole thing more fascinating, not less. Because if a revived DT50X, just like this, would genuinely solve a huge problem for the motorcycle world, you gotta wonder, why hasn't somebody already just built the damn thing? If you're curious where this whole small bike movement might be heading and what happens when a company does go all in, I've got another deep dive concept breakdown on screen right now. Go tap that, and I'll catch you in the next one.